He placed the leather portfolio on the white linen tablecloth with a thud that was both soft and absolute, a sound of expensive things meeting other expensive things. Inside lay a single framed drawing. Outside, the lights of Chicago glittered against the dark expanse of Lake Michigan, 1,000 miles and $1 billion away from the world of the young woman refilling his water glass. $10,000, Julian Croft announced, his voice a low baritone that cut through the restaurant's genteel murmur. He tapped a manicured finger on the smooth, calf-skin leather. His eyes, the color of polished steel, were not on his dinner companions, but on the waitress. "I'll bet $10,000 cash that you can't tell me one single verifiable thing wrong with this piece." He thought he was being clever, staging a bit of cruel theater for his private equity partners. He thought he was making a point about class, about the unbridgeable chasm between those who serve and those who are served. He saw a tired young woman in a black uniform, her name, Clara, stitched in simple white thread over her heart. He saw a nobody, but he didn't know who Clara really was. He didn't know that the hands now pouring his Pellegrino had spent thousands of hours learning to distinguish the paper pulp of the 17th century from the 18th. He didn't know that behind her weary, 22-year-old eyes was a mind that held a library of artists' signatures, ink compositions, and the subtle tells of the world's greatest forgers. He was a predator who had just stumbled into the den of a sleeping lioness, and in the crushing silence that was about to fall, a life would be shattered, and another would be forged anew. The air in Aria, one of Chicago's most exclusive rooftop restaurants, was thin and smelled of money. It was a carefully curated aroma of truffle oil, vintage Bordeaux, and the faint, clean scent of ironed linen. For Clara Bellwether, it mostly smelled like the end of a 14-hour double shift. Her feet throbbed in a dull, rhythmic agony inside her sensible, non-slip shoes. Each step was a small, private mountain to be climbed. For the past 3 years, this had been her life. A grueling ballet of carrying heavy trays, memorizing impossibly complex orders, and maintaining a practiced, serene smile while her mind was screaming. She was a ghost in this world, visible only when a glass was empty or a fork was dropped. The patrons saw her uniform, not the person inside it. They didn't see the girl who had once been the star pupil of the Art Institute of Chicago's conservation program, the daughter of the legendary art restorer Arthur Bellwether. They didn't see the shadow of the foreclosure notice that sat on her kitchen table, a crisp, legal-sized death warrant for the only home she had ever known. "Table 7 needs their check, Clara, and the Crofts are getting restless," muttered Maria, the floor manager, her face a permanent mask of stressed efficiency. "On it," Clara replied, her voice a low murmur. She moved toward the corner booth, the one with the panoramic view of the city. This was Julian Croft's regular table. He was a titan of industry, a corporate raider whose company, Croft Capital, was famous for buying businesses, gutting them for profit, and leaving the husks behind. He was new money, loud and insecure, and he treated the restaurant staff with a particular kind of disdain, as if their very existence was a personal affront to his success. Clara approached the table with the practiced invisibility of a seasoned server. Croft was holding court, his 3 companions, all men in suits that cost more than her car, hanging on his every word. "And the auction house authenticated it, of course," Croft was saying, his voice dripping with self-satisfaction. "But they missed the provenance link to the von Hessler collection. My people found it. A beautiful little chalk study by Jean-Antoine Watteau, a steal at $2.4 million. He gestured for more wine, not looking at Clara, simply waving a hand in her general direction, as if summoning a servant in a period drama. As she leaned in to pour the deep red liquid, Her eyes fell upon the drawing inside the open portfolio on the table. It was a delicate piece, a study of a woman's hands, rendered in red and black chalk on rough, cream-colored paper. It was beautiful, and it was utterly, completely wrong. It wasn't a conscious thought, but a visceral reaction. A dissonant chord struck deep in her soul. A tiny muscle in her jaw twitched. The angle of the cross-hatching in the shadows was too precise, too mechanical. The sanguine chalk was just a shade too orange, lacking the faint brownish undertone of iron oxide, pigments common in the early 18th century. It was a masterful fake, but a fake nonetheless. She finished pouring the wine and began to retreat. Her job was to be silent, to be a ghost. Arguing with a man like Julian Croft was professional suicide. It was financial suicide. The foreclosure date was less than a month away. She needed every single dollar of her meager tips. "Something on your mind, sweetheart?" Croft's voice sliced through her thoughts. He had seen it. He had seen the flicker of something in her eyes as she'd looked at his precious drawing. He was a predator, and he had sensed a deviation in the herd. Clara froze. "No, sir. Just admiring the art." "Admiring it?" One of his companions chuckled, a sycophantic little laugh. "I doubt she knows Watteau from Warhol." Now, let's not be cruel," Croft said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Perhaps she's an art critic in her spare time. Tell me." He leaned forward, his steel-grey eyes pinning her. "What do you really think of it? Don't be shy." The air grew thick. The other diners were beginning to notice the focused tension at the corner table. This was a performance, and she was the unwilling star. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the blood draining from her face. Years of training, of listening to her father murmur about the secrets hidden in paper and pigment, fought against the desperate, primal need to keep her job. Her father. The thought of him was a fresh stab of pain. Arthur Bellwether had been ruined by a forgery scandal. Accused of authenticating a fake Rembrandt, his reputation had been destroyed, his spirit broken. He had died of a heart attack 6 months later, leaving his family with a mountain of legal debt and a legacy of shame. That foreclosure notice was the final, bitter inheritance from that scandal. "It's very lovely, sir," she stammered, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Lovely?" Croft's voice was laced with mockery. "That's it? That's your professional opinion? Lovely?" He looked at his friends, rolling his eyes. "This is what I'm talking about. A complete lack of intellectual curiosity. A life lived on the surface." He turned back to her, his voice hardening. "You looked at it like you knew something. I saw it. So, what is it? Did you see a smudge? A fingerprint from one of the little people who handled it before it got to me?" The phrase "little people" landed like a punch to the gut. It was the casual, unthinking cruelty of it that broke through her fear. In that moment, she wasn't just a waitress. She was Arthur Bellwether's daughter. And the silence that had protected her for 3 years suddenly felt like a betrayal of everything he had taught her. She lifted her head, and for the first time, she met Julian Croft's gaze directly. "The stumping," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the tension. "It's too smooth." Croft blinked. "The what?" "The stumping," she repeated, a little louder now. "The technique of rubbing the chalk with a tightly rolled piece of paper or leather to create soft, tonal gradations. Watteau's stumping was notoriously energetic, almost frantic. You can see it in his studies at the Louvre. This," she gestured with her chin toward the drawing, "is too controlled, too perfect. It has the texture of airbrushed makeup. not the work of a hand that held charcoal. A profound silence descended upon the table. Croft's companions stared at her, their mouths slightly agape. Croft himself looked as if he'd been slapped. He had expected a mumbled apology, not a technical critique of 18th century drawing techniques. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dangerously low. "And the paper," Clara continued, the words now tumbling out, a dam of suppressed knowledge bursting forth. Watteau favoured laid paper with prominent chain lines, usually about an inch apart. From here I can see the watermark, a faint fleur-de-lis, but there are no chain lines visible at all. This appears to be wove paper, which wasn't widely used in France until the late 1770s. Watteau died in 1721. The blood drained from Croft's face. He was no art historian, but he was a collector. He knew the terms. He knew enough to know that what she was saying wasn't just an opinion. It was an accusation, backed by facts he couldn't immediately refute. He felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up his neck. A waitress, a 20-something girl in a cheap uniform, was dissecting his multi-million-dollar acquisition in front of his business partners. It was unthinkable. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he hissed, his composure cracking. "You read a book once, watched a documentary. You have no idea what you're talking about." "I know my father taught me to look at the paper first, then the medium, then the hand," Clara said, her voice steady, though her insides were churning with a terrifying mixture of adrenaline and fear. Croft's anger boiled over. He needed to reassert control. He needed to crush her. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a money clip, a thick wedge of $100 bills held together by a solid gold clasp. He peeled off a stack, counting them with sharp, angry snaps of his thumb. He slammed the money onto the table. It was a thick, perfect brick of cash. $10,000, he announced, his voice booming now, drawing the attention of the entire restaurant. "Cold, hard cash." He fixed her with a venomous glare. "I bet 10 grand you can't tell me one single verifiable thing wrong with this piece. Not your opinion on stumping. Not some half-remembered trivia about paper. Something real. Something I can check right now. Something that proves you're not just blowing smoke to impress us." The room was utterly still. Maria, the manager, was frozen by the service station, her face pale with horror. "And if you're wrong," Croft leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more menacing than his shouting, "you don't just lose. You get on your knees, right here, and you apologize for embarrassing me. Then you walk out that door and never come back. You're fired, in front of everyone." Clara looked at the stack of money. $10,000. It wasn't just a number. It was the exact amount she needed to stop the foreclosure. It was the difference between having a home and being on the street. It was a miracle wrapped in a nightmare. She looked at Julian Croft's smug, arrogant face. He was so certain. He believed in the power of his money, in the experts he paid, in the fundamental order of the universe where waitresses did not challenge billionaires. He wasn't just betting on the drawing, he was betting on his worldview. "What's the time limit?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Croft laughed, a short barking sound. "You want a time limit? Fine. You've got 5 minutes, before my expert on the phone tells me you're a fraud." Clara took a deep breath, the expensive air of the restaurant feeling thin and useless in her lungs. She thought of her father's workshop, the comforting smell of linseed oil and old paper. She thought of his gentle hands, showing her how to hold a magnifying loupe. "Look closer, Clara. The truth is always in the details the arrogant man overlooks." "Deal," she said. The word hung in the air, a declaration of war. Julian Croft sat back, a triumphant smirk on his face. He gestured grandly to the drawing. "Be my guest. The clock is ticking." The world seemed to shrink until it contained only Clara, the table, and the drawing. The ambient noise of the restaurant faded into a dull roar, like the sound of the sea in a shell. She stepped forward, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This wasn't an academic exercise anymore. This was for her home. This was for her father. She didn't ask to touch the piece. She knew better. She leaned over the table, her body language shifting from that of a deferential server to an intense scholar. Her eyes, which had been downcast and tired moments before, were now sharp and focused, scanning the surface of the drawing with a terrifying intensity. "1 minute down," Croft announced theatrically, tapping his gold watch. "Feeling the pressure yet?" Clara ignored him. She wasn't looking at the overall image anymore. She was deconstructing it. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of observation, began its work. She noted the way the black chalk sat on top of the sanguine chalk in the cross-hatching, a common technique, but the pressure was uniform across both. A master like Watteau, working at speed, would have had subtle variations in pressure. This felt printed. No, not printed. Drawn by a hand that was copying, not creating. She leaned closer, her nose just inches from the glass of the frame. She focused on the signature in the bottom right corner. Watteau. It was a fluid, confident script. But something was wrong. Her father had once spent a month restoring a verified Watteau sketchbook. He had made her memorize the artist's hand. Watteau's W was flamboyant, almost a flourish, but the two T's that followed were always connected by a single, sharp, upward stroke. In this signature, the crossbar of the first T was a separate, distinct mark, a tiny detail, a fatal one. 2 minutes, Croft's voice cut in, laced with smug satisfaction. "Finding anything in the twilight zone you've disappeared into?" His friends chuckled nervously. They were starting to look uncomfortable. This had stopped being fun and was starting to feel cruel. Clara's eyes darted from the signature to the bottom edge of the paper. She saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible mark, no bigger than a pinhead. It wasn't part of the drawing. It was a stamp, a blind stamp, an embossed mark without ink. It was a collector's mark. She recognized it instantly. It was the crest of the Marchese di Ferri, a notorious 19th century Italian collector and forger. The Marchese was famous for commissioning brilliant fakes of 18th century French masters, and then discovering them, seeding them into the art market with impeccable but falsified provenance. Her father had written a paper on him. This was it. This was the verifiable proof. But it wasn't enough. Croft could argue it was a later collector's mark. She needed something more, something undeniable. 3 minutes. The silence is deafening, Croft taunted. Clara's gaze swept over the drawing one last time, a final, desperate search. And then she saw it. It was so small, so insignificant, that 100 experts could have missed it. In the deepest shadow, under the knuckle of the drawn hand, was a single graphite pencil line, barely visible beneath the layers of black chalk. A preliminary sketch line. Graphite pencils, as they are known today, encased in wood, were not invented until the 1790s by Nicolas Jacques Conté. In Watteau's time, artists used lumps of raw graphite or lead styluses, which left a silvery, fainter mark. This was the dark, crisp line of a modern pencil. It was an anachronism. It was the modern nail in the coffin of an old master fake. 4 minutes, Croft called out. Time to start practicing your apology, I think. Clara straightened up. She took a slow, deliberate breath, calming the tremor in her hands. She placed her palms flat on the table, leaning forward slightly. The posture was no longer subservient. It was authoritative. She looked directly at Julian Croft, her eyes clear and cold as ice. "I'm ready," she said. Croft raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you are? Well, don't let me stop you. You have 60 seconds to save your job. Dazzle us." "The bet was for one single, verifiable thing wrong with this piece," Clara began, her voice resonating with a newfound strength that silenced the entire room. "I will give you 4. She pointed a single, steady finger at the drawing. "First, as I mentioned, the paper is wove, not laid. An expert can verify this by looking at the texture against a light source. It is post-1770s. Watteau died in 1721. Strike 1. Croft's smile faltered. "Second, the signature. The crossbar on the first T in Watteau is disconnected from the upstroke connecting it to the second T. In every authenticated example of his signature from his mature period, that stroke is continuous. It suggests the hesitation of a forger, not the confidence of the artist signing his own name. A forensic graphologist can verify that. Strike 2. The faces of Croft's companions were now masks of disbelief. Kevin, the youngest, slowly pulled out his phone, his thumbs flying across the screen, no doubt searching for examples of Watteau's signature. "Third," Clara's voice grew harder, more precise. "There is a blind stamp in the bottom left corner, the crest of the Marchese de Ferri. He was a 19th century collector. If this piece was in his collection, it breaks your claimed provenance to the von Hessler collection, which was dispersed in the 1780s, a century before the Marchese was even born. Your own people can verify that with a simple database search. Strike 3. Croft was now pale, his arrogance evaporating like mist. He stared at the drawing as if seeing it for the first time. Clara leaned in for the final, killing blow. "But all of that is circumstantial. You wanted something verifiable right now." She looked Croft dead in the eye. "Ask one of your friends for their phone. Use the flashlight. Shine it at a 45-degree angle on the darkest shadow under the knuckle of the left thumb. Tell me what you see." A tense silence fell. Croft looked at his young associate, Kevin, who was already holding his phone, the flashlight app open. With a trembling hand, Kevin leaned over and shined the bright LED light onto the drawing. What am I looking for?" Kevin stammered. "Look for a glint," Clara commanded. "Look for the sheen of graphite underneath the matte finish of the chalk." Kevin angled the light, and then he saw it. A tiny, razor-thin line of silvery grey, distinct from the deep black of the chalk surrounding it. "My God," he whispered, looking up from the drawing to Clara, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. "She's right. It's a pencil line. A modern pencil line." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so deep and profound it felt like a physical weight. The clinking of distant silverware, the murmur of other conversations, the entire world outside their corner booth ceased to exist. Julian Croft sat frozen, his face a canvas of warring emotions. Shock, disbelief, and the slow, dawning horror of utter and complete humiliation. The predator had been dissected, piece by piece, by his prey. He stared at the drawing, his $2.4 million monument to his own ego, now revealed as a worthless fraud. He looked at the faces of his partners, who were carefully avoiding his gaze, their expressions a mixture of pity and fear. Finally, he looked at Clara. She hadn't moved. She stood there, her hands still flat on the table, a statue of quiet vindication. The tired waitress was gone. In her place stood a woman of immense, formidable power. "Well?" she asked, her voice soft but unforgiving. "The 5 minutes are up." The spell broke. Kevin snatched his phone back as if the drawing were radioactive. The other two men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly finding the patterns on their bread plates fascinating. It can't be," Croft stammered, the words catching in his throat. He fumbled for his own phone, his fingers clumsy. He speed-dialed a number. "Get me, Alistair," he barked into the receiver. "Now!" A moment later, a voice with a crisp British accent crackled through the speakerphone he'd activated. "Julian? It's 3 a.m. in London." "Alistair, the Watto, the study of hands," Croft said, his voice strained. "Did you check for underdrawing?" "Of course, we X-rayed it. Nothing but chalk." "Not X-ray," Croft snapped. "Graphite, under the chalk in the primary shadow work. A modern pencil line." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Julian, that's impossible. The provenance is fake," Croft roared, slamming his free hand on the table, rattling the wine glasses. "The paper is wove, the signature is forged, and it has the goddamn Marchese de Ferri's blind stamp on it." Another, longer silence. Then the expert's voice, now small and defeated, came through the phone. "The Marchese! Oh God! Julian, Croft hung up, tossing the phone onto the table. He looked at the brick of cash. $10,000. It seemed like such an insignificant amount now. An insult. He had built an empire on his ability to assess value, to see what others missed, to gut the weakness from a system, and he had been made a fool of by a waitress over an asset in his own chosen field of expertise. He looked up at Clara. The anger was gone, replaced by a bewildering, terrifying curiosity. "Who are you?" he asked, the question a raw whisper. This wasn't the taunt from before. This was a genuine plea for information, the desperate query of a man whose reality has just been fundamentally dismantled. Clara finally relaxed her posture, pulling her hands from the table. She picked up her tray of empty glasses, the familiar weight a strange comfort. "My name is Clara Bellwether," she said, her voice even. The name clearly meant nothing to him, but she wasn't finished. "My father was Arthur Bellwether." This time the name landed like a physical blow. Croft flinched. Anyone who moved in the high-end art world knew that name. Arthur Bellwether, the brilliant conservator, the man at the center of the Van Meegeren Rembrandt scandal 5 years ago, the man who had authenticated a newly discovered masterpiece that was later revealed to be a brilliant, modern forgery, destroying his career and his life. "Bellwether's daughter?" Croft breathed, leaning back in the booth. The leather sighed under his weight. "I thought the family was ruined. Disgraced." "We were," Clara said, her eyes holding his. There was no hatred in her gaze, only a profound, bottomless weariness. "That's why I'm here, serving you wine." The pieces clicked into place in Croft's mind. The impossible knowledge, the forensic eye, the familiarity with forgers' tells. This wasn't a lucky guess. It was a lifetime of training. He hadn't been beaten by a waitress. He had been beaten by a legacy. He looked at the money. Then he looked at her. He pushed the stack of cash across the table with 2 fingers. "You won." Clara didn't move to take it. "The other part of the deal," she said quietly. Croft stared at her, confused. "What?" "If I lost, I was to get on my knees and apologize. Then I would be fired in front of everyone." She recited the terms of his own cruel bet, her voice flat and emotionless. "I won. So you will apologize. To me. For your behavior tonight. And then you will tell my manager that my service was exemplary." The demand was audacious. It was unthinkable. For a man like Julian Croft, An apology was a greater price than any amount of money. It was an admission of weakness, of error. His partners held their breath. Croft's jaw tightened. A war was being fought behind his steel-grey eyes. Every instinct, every fibre of his being screamed at him to refuse, to lash out, to destroy her for this final humiliation. But as he looked at her, standing there with her tray of dirty glasses, possessing a dignity that all his billions couldn't buy, he knew he had lost more than just a bet. He had lost the moral high ground so completely that he was in a crater. Slowly, deliberately, Julian Croft slid out of the booth. He stood up, and for the first time that night, he looked at Clara Bellwether not as a servant, but as an equal, as a superior. "You are right," he said, his voice hoarse. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "I apologize. My behavior was inexcusable." He then turned his head toward the manager, Maria, who was still standing frozen near the kitchen door. "Maria," he called out, his voice regaining some of its command. "Your waitress, Clara, has provided the most insightful service I have ever received. She deserves a bonus." Having paid his penance, he turned back to Clara. He gestured again to the cash. "Take it." This time Clara reached out. Her fingers, chapped from detergents and hard work, closed around the crisp bills. She didn't count it. She simply slid the thick stack into the pocket of her apron, where it rested against a crumpled, tear-stained copy of the foreclosure notice. "Thank you," she said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, Table 9 has been waiting for their dessert menus." She turned to walk away, the embodiment of professionalism, as if she had not just dismantled a rich man's world. "Wait." Croft's voice was sharp, urgent. He scrambled to move around the table, blocking her path. The desperate curiosity had morphed into something else, the rapacious hunger of an investor who has just discovered a unicorn. The sting of humiliation was already being processed, compartmentalized, and filed away under acceptable losses. Now, all he could see was the asset, the untapped, undervalued world-class resource standing before him in a cheap polyester uniform. He pulled a sleek black business card from his wallet. It was made of metal, impossibly thin, his name and private number etched in silver. It felt cold and absolute in his hand. "This is not over," he said, his voice a low, intense current that was for her alone. "I want you to work for me." Clara looked at the card, an obsidian sliver against the pale skin of his palm. She then looked back at his face, at the steel-grey eyes that no longer held contempt, but a terrifying, possessive focus. The offer hung in the air, thick with the smell of money, power, and the silent, expectant stares of every diner in the restaurant. They were watching a fairy tale unfold. The brilliant, downtrodden girl, discovered and rescued by the humbled, handsome prince. "I'm not an analyst, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of solid stone. "I don't know how to gut companies for parts." "I don't want you to gut them," he insisted, taking a half-step closer, a conspiratorial urgency in his tone. "I want you to do that, what you just did. I spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year on acquisitions, art, real estate, entire corporations. I pay teams of so-called experts, men with PhDs from Oxford and the Sorbonne, to perform due diligence. And they miss things. They miss the tells. He paused, searching for the right word. "You see the pencil marks under the paint. You see the structural flaws everyone else misses. I want that eye. I need that eye." He extended the card further. "I will start you at $500,000 a year, $1 million. Name your price. I will build you a laboratory that would make the Getty weep with envy, a staff of researchers, access to any database in the world. I will make you the single most powerful, most feared name in the world of authentication. It was the dream, not a vague, wistful fantasy, but the tangible, fully formed life that had been stolen from her and her father. It was redemption served on a platinum platter, a way out of the bone-deep exhaustion, the crushing debt, the inherited shame. It was a golden ladder lowered from the heavens directly into the suffocating pit where she had been living for 3 years. She could see it all with perfect, painful clarity. The beautiful, sunlit office overlooking the lake, the respectful colleagues who would hang on her every word, the ability to finally provide her mother with a life free from fear, the salvation of the house her father had built. And yet, a cold stillness settled in her heart. She looked at Julian Croft, at the acquisitive gleam that had replaced his fury. He wasn't offering her a job out of respect for her character or contrition for his cruelty. He was making a strategic acquisition. He wanted to own her talent, to put her unique, God-given, father-honed gift on his payroll and turn it into another asset on his balance sheet, another weapon in his corporate arsenal. An hour ago, he had dismissed her as one of the little people. Now he wanted to make her his queen, but she would still be a chess piece on his board. A possession. "The things I see, Mr. Croft," she said slowly, the words chosen with the same care she would use to restore a crumbling fresco, "are not for sale." The incomprehension on his face was absolute. It was as if she had just explained that the sky was green. "What? Are you insane? This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You're throwing it away out of... what? Pride? Because I was an arse to you for 10 minutes? My father had his name, his career, and his life destroyed because he put his trust in the wrong wealthy man," Clara said, her gaze unwavering, holding his. He was used as a shield of credibility, and when the scandal broke, he was discarded like a broken tool. I learned from his mistake. My knowledge, my eye. It is the only thing my father left me that wasn't encumbered by debt. It is mine, and it will not be owned. Her hand moved to the pocket of her apron, where the thick brick of $10,000 sat, a warm, solid promise against her thigh. "You and I conducted a business transaction. It is now complete. This money will solve my immediate problem. For anything more, I will find my own way." "You'll be back here serving coffee in a month when that runs out," Croft hissed, his composure finally shattering under the strain of her irrationality. The frustration and disbelief curdled back into cruelty. Clara offered him a small, sad smile that did not reach her eyes. "Perhaps. But if I am, I will be doing it as a free woman." She sidestepped him then, a simple, fluid movement that left him standing alone. The tray of glasses in her hand clinked softly, a sound as mundane and final as a closing door. She walked away from the corner booth, away from the $1 million offer, away from the man who had tried to break her and then tried to buy her. As she moved through the silent, watching restaurant, she felt a profound lightness in her chest, an absence of a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for years. The foreclosure, the debt, the shame of her father's legacy. It was all still there, waiting for her outside these gilded doors, but it felt manageable, different. She had faced the dragon in his lair, looked into his fiery eyes, and had walked out of the flames, not with a prince or a rescue, but with a fistful of cash and her own soul intact. Behind her, Julian Croft stood utterly alone, the rejected metal business card still held foolishly in his outstretched hand, surrounded by the invisible wreckage of his pride and certainty. He had tried to purchase a moment of cruel entertainment and had instead been given a masterclass in the true nature of value. And he was beginning to understand, with a cold, sinking certainty that filled the space where his arrogance used to be, that for all his billions, he was the poorest man in the room. The train ride home was a strange, vibrating limbo between two worlds. The opulent cage of Aria faded behind her, replaced by the flickering fluorescent lights and the rhythmic clatter of the L train heading west toward Oak Park. The $10,000 brick was in her handbag now, wrapped in a linen napkin. It felt impossibly heavy, a dense, rectangular anchor of reality. Clara leaned her forehead against the cool, grimy glass of the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold and red. The adrenaline had long since evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. And doubt. A cold, creeping serpent of doubt. $1 million. The number echoed in the cavern of her mind. $1 million. She could have said yes. In one breath, she could have erased every financial worry she and her mother would ever have. She could have resurrected her father's name with the power and prestige Croft offered. She could have had the lab, the resources, the life she was supposed to have. What had she done? Thrown it all away for a principle? Pride, as he'd called it. Was her freedom worth a lifetime of struggle? Her fingers tightened on her bag. She closed her eyes, and the image of her father's face appeared. Not as he was at the end, grey, defeated, and haunted, but from years before, in his workshop. He was holding a small, damaged drawing up to the light, his eyes alight with passionate curiosity. "Look closer, Clara," he'd murmured, his voice smelling of linseed oil and old paper. "Never trust the story. Trust the object. The object never lies. People do. Money does. But the paper, the pigment, they hold the truth if you know how to listen." He hadn't been owned. He had worked with Cest, collectors and museums, but never, wow, for them. His name, Arthur Bellwether, had been his brand, his bond, until one man, one lie, one object, had shattered it all. She understood now, with a clarity that cut through the fear, that Croft wasn't offering to restore her father's legacy. He was offering to repeat his mistakes, only on a grander, more lucrative scale. She would become the Bellwether Eye, a trademarked asset of Croft Capital. The thought sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the drafty train car. No. She had made the right choice. It was the harder choice, the terrifying choice. But it was hers. The train lurched to a stop at her station. Stepping onto the platform, the cool, damp night air felt clean in her lungs. She walked the few blocks home, the weight in her bag no longer feeling like an anchor, but like a foundation, a cornerstone she could build upon. Julian Croft did not sleep. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, a tumbler of untouched Macallan 25 in his hand, watching the dawn break over Lake Michigan. The sky bled from bruised purple to a cold, clinical grey. He had dismissed his partners with a curt, non-negotiable wave of his hand the moment Clara Bellwether had vanished from sight. The ride home had been silent, the city lights reflecting off his face like meaningless data points. Humiliation was a foreign country to him. He had never visited. Now, he found himself a permanent resident. It wasn't just that she had proven him wrong about the drawing. It was the surgical precision with which she had dismantled his entire worldview. He operated on a simple, universal principle. Everything and everyone had a price. His genius was in accurately calculating that price before anyone else. He had offered Clara Bellwether a price that was, by any rational measure, far beyond her market value, and she had refused. It was like watching a law of physics fail. He had replayed the encounter 100 times, dissecting her every word, every micro-expression. The quiet confidence, the profound, weary sadness in her eyes when she spoke of her father, the utter lack of fear. She wasn't playing a game. She wasn't negotiating for a better offer. She was stating a fact. She was not for sale. By 7 a.m., the raw, emotional wound of his pride had begun to scar over, replaced by the cold, familiar calculus of an obsession. He didn't just want to understand her. He needed to. He buzzed his chief of security. "Get me everything you can on a Clara Bellwether," he commanded, his voice raspy from disuse. "And I want to know everything about her father, Arthur Bellwether, the scandal, the lawsuits, everything." The file arrived on his desk by noon. It was thin, as the lives of the financially ruined often are. He read it in his silent office, the city's muted roar a distant soundtrack. Top of her class at the Art Institute. Dropped out in her final year to care for her ailing mother and work. The foreclosure notice on a modest bungalow in Oak Park. The final, bitter inheritance from her father's professional ruin. He lingered on the details of the scandal. Arthur Bellwether, a man of unimpeachable reputation, had authenticated a newly discovered Rembrandt. It had been purchased for a staggering sum by a private equity rival of Croft's, a man named Marcus Thorne. 6 months later, a disgruntled former associate of the dealer had come forward with proof. The painting was a masterful forgery by a notorious modern artist. The fallout was catastrophic. Thorne's reputation took a hit, but he had the wealth to absorb it. The dealer vanished. Arthur Bellwether, whose name had been the linchpin of the sale's credibility, was left holding the bag. He was sued into oblivion, his life's work reduced to a cautionary tale. He died of a heart attack less than a year later. Croft leaned back, the leather of his chair groaning in the silence. It all clicked into place. The girl wasn't acting out of pride. She was acting out of history. She was the living embodiment of her father's costly lesson. She saw him, Julian Croft, and didn't see a savior. She saw Marcus Thorne, 2.0. A strange, unfamiliar feeling settled in his chest. It was not anger. It was not even curiosity. It was a cold, sharp pang of respect. 3 weeks later, a storm rolled in off the lake, throwing sheets of rain against the windows of Croft's office. The city had disappeared behind a veil of grey. The gloom had settled inside him, a persistent, low-grade irritation. The Bellwether file was still on his desk, its contents memorized. His team had confirmed that the foreclosure on her home had been halted the day after their encounter. They also confirmed she had quit her job at Aria that same night. And then she had vanished from the grid. No new job, no social media presence, nothing. The silence gnawed at him. His intercom buzzed, startling him. "Mr. Croft, a courier is here with a package for you. He insists it must be delivered to you personally, from a Ms. C. Bellwether." Croft's heart gave a hard, single jolt. "Send him in." A moment later, a drenched courier handed him a simple, sturdy cardboard tube and a thick, letter-sized manila envelope. Croft signed for it, his hand strangely unsteady. He waited until the office door clicked shut, then carried the items to his vast mahogany desk. He opened the envelope first. Inside was not a letter begging for a second chance, but a bound document. The cover page was stark, printed in a clean, elegant serif font. It read, "The Bellwether Initiative, a proposal for a new standard in forensic authentication." He began to read, his initial surprise giving way to a dawning, electrifying awe. It was a comprehensive business plan, meticulously detailed and brutally intelligent. It proposed the creation of a small, independent, elite authentication firm. It outlined a revolutionary methodology, a three-pronged approach that combined traditional connoisseurship, the eye she had inherited, with cutting-edge forensic science and a deep dive into financial provenance, tracking the flow of money as rigorously as the chain of ownership. It laid out a fee structure based not on a percentage of an artwork's value, a practice she noted was inherently corrupting, but on a flat, transparent, hourly rate. The entire proposal was a declaration of war against the compromised, self-serving status quo of the art world. It was designed for one thing, and one thing only: absolute, incorruptible truth. On the final page, tucked behind the projected financials, was a single sheet of heavy cream-colored paper. A handwritten note. Mr. Croft. You wanted to buy my eye. I told you it was not for sale, but it is available for hire. You were correct about one thing. The world is filled with beautiful, expensive lies, and the experts are too often part of the deception. There is a market for the truth. This is my proposal. I will not be your employee. I will be the founder and director of my own firm. The enclosed tube contains my first official piece of work. Consider it a demonstration of capabilities. If you are interested in becoming my first client, and perhaps an initial seed investor in exchange for a minority, non-controlling equity stake, you have my number. Sincerely, Clara Bellwether. Croft's hands were trembling slightly as he put the letter down. A minority, non-controlling stake. She wasn't just setting the terms, she was dictating the entire power structure. She was inviting him to her table, not asking for a seat at his. He looked at the sealed cardboard tube. With a sense of mounting reverence, he broke the seal and carefully unrolled the contents on his desk. It was a large, museum-quality photographic print of his fake Watto, but it was covered in a web of annotations, like a battlefield map. Red lines pointed to dozens of microscopic inconsistencies she hadn't even bothered to mention in the restaurant. A detailed chemical analysis of the sanguine chalk was noted in the margins, identifying its origins to a specific region in modern Italy, not 18th century France. A historical summary of the Marchese de Ferri's known forgeries was attached, highlighting stylistic parallels. It was a masterpiece of deconstruction. Beneath it was a second document, the real heart of the package. It was a 20-page report, bound in the same simple, elegant style as the business plan. The title made the breath catch in his throat. A preliminary forensic and financial investigation into the forgery ring, responsible for the Van Meegeren Rembrandt of 2018. He began to read, and the world outside his window ceased to exist. Clara had not just been serving tables for 3 years. She had been quietly, obsessively, brilliantly investigating the very conspiracy that had destroyed her father. Using her student access to the Art Institute's archives, she had cross-referenced sales records, auction catalogues, and chemical analyses of other suspected fakes from the same dealer. The report laid out a devastatingly convincing case, a spider's web of shell corporations, falsified provenance, and quiet collaboration that implicated not just the dealer, but the powerful collector who had bought the fake, Marcus Thorne. She had found the truth her father had been unable to see. She had found the pencil marks under the paint of the entire scheme. The only thing she had lacked were the resources to take the fight public. Croft leaned back in his chair, the document spread before him like a royal flush. She hadn't just rejected his money. She had come back with a counteroffer that was infinitely more ambitious, more audacious, and more brilliant than he could have imagined. She wasn't asking for a lifeline. She was offering him a weapon, a chance to invest in something real, something built on integrity in a world of lies, and, not incidentally, a chance to publicly eviscerate his old rival, Marcus Thorne, on a matter of principle. A slow smile spread across Julian Croft's face. It was not the smug smile of a predator who has cornered his prey, but the exhilarated, predatory grin of a shark who has just discovered another, equally dangerous shark in the water. This was a game he understood. This was a deal worth making. He picked up his phone and dialed the number etched on the metal card he had tried to give her. He knew, with an instinct that had made him a billionaire, that she had kept it, waiting for this exact moment. She answered on the second ring. "Bellwether." Her voice was calm, devoid of any surprise. "Miss Bellwether," he said, the newfound respect clear in his tone. "Julian Croft, I've read your proposal, and your demonstration. It's the most compelling pitch I've seen in my career." There was a beat of silence on the other end. "And?" she asked, the single word a challenge. "And I have some notes on your capitalization table," he replied, already shifting into the language of partnership. "But your valuation of the truth, I think you've underestimated it. Let's talk about your Series A funding. I'm in." The rain continued to lash against the windows, but inside the office, the storm had passed. A partnership was being forged, born not of a fairy tale rescue, but of a brutal transaction that had revealed the true worth of two formidable people. Clara Bellwether had won more than a bet. She had reclaimed her name, her future, and her father's legacy, all on her own unwavering terms. And Julian Croft had finally learned the most valuable lesson of his career. Some assets are so rare, so foundational, you don't buy them. You divest yourself of your own ego and beg for a minority stake in their story.